Hello everyone, I am Divisha and welcome back to the Wellbeing Pod. So for this month's episode, we're going to approach the topic of compassion-focused therapy. Today, our guest comes from the UK, Dr. Sunil, consultant counseling psychologist at the NHS. We will learn a little bit more about what compassion-focused therapy is, how it integrates with yoga, Dr. Ladd's experience working in the UK prison system, and finally a few insights on how you can use the concepts of compassion-based approach to tackle issues such as self-criticism. Let's get to it. Happy listening. So welcome Dr. Sunil Ladd, and thank you for being our guest on our podcast for today. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so thank you. It's an honor to be asked to speak to you and your students today. So I'm a consultant counselling psychologist and I work in the NHS in the UK. So my job essentially is to provide psychological services within healthcare in prisons, predominantly male prisons. We are recently working in a prison with females as well. So I guess over my career, it's generally been about working and understanding the effects of trauma and why some people may have mental health problems as a result of the trauma and adversity they've experienced, but also why some people end up offending and committing crime as a result of being shaped in certain environments.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And from the work that I've seen that you've done, a lot of it is focused on compassion-based approach. Can you tell us a little bit more on what is it about actually?
Yep, sure. So the compassion-focused therapy approach is an evolutionary model. So really understanding that as humans, we've kind of developed over millions of years. And as a result, we've got this brain and body that we didn't necessarily choose. And it has certain glitches. So the example that often we get is if you think about a zebra and a zebra sees a lion, it successfully runs away from that. Let's say it successfully runs away. Half an hour afterwards, it just go back to eating grass. But if we saw a lion, for example, half an hour afterwards, we wouldn't be going back to our normal day-to-day activities. We'd be thinking, we'd be worrying. Because of this brain that we've got, slightly new brain, it means that we can think about the future and the past, and that often causes many different problems for us. On top of that, we've also got different emotions which have developed over, again, millions of years, which have got a function. So if we think about how we lived in very different societies in the past, whereas since the advent of agriculture about 7,000 years ago, we are living, we've got a lot more resources, which have really given rise to a more darker side of aspects of humanity, like greed and other things, which have also led to in-group and out-groups, which have caused a lot of problems on the earth. And I guess in terms of the work I do, why this evolutionary model has kind of changed the way that I work, it really helps to understand why some people end up committing offences as well. So I guess compassion-focused therapy is a very evolutionary model, also kind of thinking about in terms of how individuals develop, the importance of attachment is really thought about. So if we think about how we used to live in very small groups, whereas I guess now, if we live in urban settings, you're raised by mainly your parents, whereas historically you were raised by a whole community. And I guess what compassion-focused therapy really recognizes is a lot of that, but also how we might live in a sense of threat. So not feeling good enough, not wanting to be rejected, which creates lots of shame and obviously mental health distress in individuals. Obviously, that's a very short summary. There's lots of texts out there. There's lots of good videos there which kind of describe it really well. But that is a very short summary and an introduction into what compassion focused therapy. And I guess what compassion focused therapy is recognizing that which causes lots of suffering. However, where we start to work with compassion is that we work with that caregiving system within, which is in us all innately. So what compassion helps us to do is have a motivation not about threat or defending or being hostile, but actually really caring, where we have empathy for others and ourselves as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This was actually a good summary of the concept. And while reading, I came across drive systems and the 3 flows of compassion. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So drive systems are extremely important because without them, so what the drive system helps us to do is make sure we achieve things. It makes sure that we are focused on gaining resources, for example. So I guess, to your students at the moment, they are coming to university in order to gain a qualification, which will hopefully give them opportunities in life to succeed. I guess sometimes when we don't achieve those gains, we go into our threat system. And I think that's when we will beat ourselves up, not feel good enough, and all of those kind of things. So the drive system can be helpful, but it needs to be in balance. Because if we don't if we don't achieve things, then we can become really harsh and self-critical compared to kind of working towards gaining things, for example. In terms of your second part, in terms of the 3 flows of compassion, slightly different point. So compassion can be experienced from someone else. So, we might have also had people be caring towards others. So that's one of the flows from where we receive from others to ourselves. Another flow of compassion is when we are compassionate towards others. And then the other flow of compassion is when we give compassion.
Track of it. So when you talk about the 3 flows and how it relates, for example, to the world around us, and why is it important to actually have compassion towards ourselves and to others at the same time?
Well, I guess we are an extremely social animal, which means that actually when we've thrived, it's when we've been cooperative towards others. But I guess in terms of how we're living our lives at the moment, at times we are very competitive, which means that we lose compassion. I don't know in Mauritius, but in the UK, we've got a lot of problems because people are constantly kind of criticizing others who aren't the same as themselves, which leads to high levels of inequality, high levels of hate, for example. And that's, it's not helping us to really thrive as a society. We see immigrants often demonized, rather than recognizing, well, actually, why are these people coming? What kind of countries are they really coming from? Which means that actually they're destitute, they haven't got a home. And we kind of lose that level of recognizing their humanity.
And what do you think led to that in a way? Like the way we evolved, how did we reach to a point where we actually lost a bit of that compassion, that empathy to recognize the suffering of others?
So I guess when we switch off from the suffering of others is often when we other people, so they're not part of our group. So again, this is kind of a new evolutionary thing. In order to care for our own, we are loving towards our own, but actually we are hostile towards the other in a way, because they might take away our resources, our ability to survive. They might take all of our food, for example. And that's why we might be hostile. But I guess, we know on this earth there is plenty of food to go around. It's just that some people hoard it. In terms of wealth, some people hoard it. And as a result, that's what causes lots of inequality and lots of hate. And I guess if we can make sure that we share, we recognize that actually everyone also has got a dark side, we can, by providing more care, we can hopefully learn to turn that off.
Kind of like we are everyone in the same boat, so we are going for similar struggles, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Recognizing that common humanity, that we all experience pain and suffering, and actually how can we support each other within that process rather than fight against each other.
Exactly. So if I may ask you, you have worked in the UK prison system for a few years, 15 years exactly. Yeah. And I'm curious to know about your experience, to bring support to the people. And how did that go for you?
I guess I kind of, so my career started in prisons. I felt maybe accidentally. So I got a job in a prison. I was just looking for opportunities to support people and work in a bit of a therapeutic role. And an opportunity popped up in a prison and I got it. And I guess since that, it's just working, I think it kind of opened my eyes for recognizing actually there's reasons people are in prisons. People have often experienced high levels of abuse as children, or there's been a lack of love, and as a result people respond in different ways to that. I guess one of the things in terms of it's really motivated me, because actually I think for me, working in the NHS, what I'm really passionate about is about giving good care to those who probably haven't had it before, who can't afford it, and to really allow to break down barriers and give support and care and understanding, so people can make a difference in their own lives, can fulfill their potential, and have a different experience of other human beings as well.
And what would you say were like the barriers to attending to their needs in a way?
Yeah, I guess, the prison system generally can be very punishing at times. I think through austerity as well, we've seen high levels of cutbacks, which have also meant that the resources have been taken out, and I think also prison can often be seen as a punishment. And that is a very different psychology to care. When we are punishing people, also have this level of anger. And actually, if we kind of want people to be rehabilitated, actually we know in terms of the research, punishment is not effective. If you are shaming people, then again, that, a level of shame can be helpful, because you think, actually, I don't want to do that. But actually, we also need people to experience guilt, and actually, in order for them to really recognize what they've done. But that sometimes requires sitting with emotions like sadness. But if you've learned that sadness is a weakness, you're not going to go there. So I think it's really important. I think there's lots of barriers in terms of the environment, in terms of even sometimes, trying to create a therapeutic space in an environment which isn't very therapeutic.
I can only imagine actually how that goes. It's very challenging for you and for the individuals as well, and how they have to work on themselves, I'm guessing, to really work through the emotions they have.
Yeah. And it's tough, because I guess what we've often seen is that, especially and during the COVID times, people have had a lot of time to think. But if you've not got the ways of coping, then that thinking can really adversely affect your mental health.
At the end of the day, it's just rumination and not really processing those thoughts and emotions.
Or learning to block it out in unhealthy ways.
And you did mention shame and guilt as emotions that people who suffer struggle with to
Mhm.
actually process. Can you tell us a little bit more about those two emotions that actually are roadblocks when it comes to
Yeah.
dealing with things in life in general?
So I guess I'd say that guilt is actually particularly helpful. So guilt comes from our caregiving system because we recognize that we've done something which has harmed someone else, which gives us and makes us want to go and repair that damage that's been done. So guilt is extremely healthy, but often gets misinterpreted for shame. And shame is slightly different. So we have two levels of shame. We have internal shame, which is when we think, oh my God, I'm a bad person. But that often leads us to want to hide away. So we don't want someone to see our defects. We don't want them to see those things. So I guess that's where, if there is shame, we see minimization, we see denial, we see avoidance. And actually, we've seen in the UK, especially in the last year, for example, following the death and the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people not wanting to have conversations about racism, minimizing it. Only happens in America. It doesn't happen here. Really avoiding it and using all sorts of distraction tactics, because actually sitting with that can feel really painful, but also no one wants to be labeled a racist. And I guess shame kind of plays out in many different ways, and that can often be a bit of a block, but we really need to understand and have safe conversations for people to feel safe in order to really understand the emotion of shame.
Okay, thank you. And you've also integrated yoga in some of your approaches, and
Mm-hmm.
I believe you're also a yoga teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us?
Yes. Yeah. So I guess, I first did all my training in compassion focused therapy. And I only I did a bit of yoga on the side. And then as I started to kind of be more compassionate towards myself, one of the things I recognized is I necessarily wasn't as connected to my body. I think being a psychologist, you're sitting a lot. But one of the things we need to recognize that emotions happen in our body. We can't just talk about them. They are a felt experience. And what yoga started to help me to do is actually learn about not just getting stuck in the brain, but really recognizing how memories might be stuck in the body as well, recognizing patterns of the body. And I guess yoga is a very different way of connecting to the body, which is very different to other maybe competitive exercises or other exercises where you are focused on a goal. So for example, that is very drive focused. If you're doing a run, counting how long you are running for, or counting how many miles or kilometers you are running for, whereas yoga is about developing an awareness. Well, it can be. I think sometimes modern yoga often focuses on getting into the pose. So for me, yoga isn't about getting into a pose. It's about the relationship you have towards your body when you are getting into a pose, recognizing what tension you might have, because often getting into the different poses mean, we aren't sitting in those poses half our days. So, moving our body in a very different way, getting a sense of what's happening might give us a level of awareness of actually what happens to our breath, for example, when we are in a more challenging pose. Actually, that's similar to when we are experiencing a distressing emotion. Can we then ground our breath? And actually, that helps us to move through an emotion at the same time, for example.
So it's like learning how to do it during a yoga session so that when you experience the emotion, you're kind of ready for it in a way.
Yeah. Be more prepared and feel, I guess, feel more grounded, because emotions can feel really overwhelming. There's a reason for them.
And during the yoga practices, like, can you give us an example of like how you would go about, for example, helping someone who has, for example, anxiety, and who would want to use yoga-focused approach to help that person with anxiety.
Yeah. So I guess by focusing on the body and what that person is going through, what will hopefully start to happen is that they will slow down their breath and they will ground in their body. So actually, if they are experiencing anxiety, what they might start to learn is that their breath gets shallow, their heart starts pumping, they have butterflies in their stomach. But what yoga will hopefully help them to do is, again, ground in the body and feel the body, because often we switch off from how our body feels because those emotions, those sensations can be quite intense. So by maybe being in a particular pose, you're learning how to use your body as support.
Okay.
To the question.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
But also, I guess, with some of the science around compassion focused therapy, we really recognize, for example, if we think about anxiety or fear, what happens is our fight and flight system comes on. So if we think about when our fight and flight system comes on, again, our heart rate increases. What we want to learn is actually how to slow that down. And that's through using our parasympathetic nervous system linked to resting and digesting. And what we know is that by slowing down our out breath, we can do that. So, for example, if you think now, how is your breathing if you are feeling anxious? Really noticing and grounding in your breath and taking a slow, deep inhale and exhale and just notice the change that happens. You'll hopefully find if your brain can focus on your body, or even, sometimes I get people to imagine a balloon in their belly. If that starts to happen, they might start to recognize that they slow down.
Mm-hmm. So if I understood correctly, integrating yoga and compassion, so it's basically like by practicing those yoga poses, you're kind of being conscious of your body and being kind to yourself in a way. Is that?
Yeah, but I guess it's when you get onto the mat, what intention are you going with? Are you going with the intention to achieve a pose, a perfect pose, like we often see on social media, people in all these flexible, bendy positions? Or are you going with the intention to connect to your body?
Okay.
And to care for your body? Because there are two different mentalities. And you'll find that if you're going for a sense of achieving the pose, getting in, it's a very different focus compared to caring for yourself. And care for yourself, the level of awareness starts to happen, will be a lot bigger compared to if you're focused on achieving.
So the intention of being compassionate towards yourself and getting to know yourself better in a way.
And that's hard because we're not often socialized to do that. It's often seen as warm and fluffy and a weakness. But actually, that sometimes means that you get in touch with suffering, and that's a courageous thing to do.
Very challenging as well to sit with the difficult emotions at some point.
Yeah. And I guess it's about learning to do it, which is safe. Safe is key.
So is it about knowing your limits in a way, like knowing what do you mean by safety?
So safeness, it's really important that we recognize that the threat system, that fight and flight system, can become problematic. Is that if we're going into a sense of difficulty, if we want to be compassionate, what we need to try and do is recognize a threat system might come on. But actually what happens to our minds become a lot more open when we feel safe. So I guess it's about having a sense of safeness So, even for example, if you're in a yoga class and the teacher comes to support you, do you feel supported, or do you tense up thinking, I've got this block? Again, feel supported, your body might be a bit more open to just get yourself into the pose, compared to if you are more tensed up, you might get yourself into an injury.
Okay. That's very insightful. Thank you. And you've mentioned the pandemic being one very, important event that happened during the past 2 years that has quite affected the way we see things around us. And how do you think compassion and being kind to ourselves help us to actually accommodate ourselves and others around us with that big change?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has recognized that we all suffer in different ways. And I think it's about really recognizing that different people will suffer. So some people might have got really distracted, really got busy in work, really got active. Other people, it's affected their mental health considerably. Other people might have gone to comfort eating, taking, drinking a lot more alcohol, using, being really unhealthy. So it's about recognizing that many different people will have coped in many different ways. Our lives have been turned upside down in a way. And I guess compassion is about actually, how do we sit with the suffering? How do we share? How do we support each other? How do we, and that's hard. How can you support each other if, for example, I know things are a bit more open now, but at the beginning, it was about restricting contact. We weren't going out. We weren't seeing people. Again, we are a very social animal. So our ability to connect also helps to regulate our nervous systems. So I guess it's about really recognizing, how do we support each other? As I said, I work in the NHS. Our motto, our whole philosophy is around caring for the sick and vulnerable. And I guess that's what really got commended during the pandemic of that's why we go and think about how to support each other. There were, great opportunities where communities were getting together, doing shopping for the elderly, all of those things. That is where the compassion has been. And that's probably kept a lot of people going in a way. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of people get very rich with this, and that has led to high levels of inequality as well.
True. And would you say after those eventful 2 years, do you think human beings in general have become more attuned to each other's suffering, or
I think, I don't know what it's like in Mauritius, but I know in the UK we are talking about mental health a lot more. I think the conversations around suffering, we're getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable and having conversations, whether it's conversations on sexism, racism, misogyny, all of that type of stuff. We are having those conversations a lot more. And I guess it's about recognizing suffering of people, which is great. It feels uncomfortable, but it needs to happen. So I'd say, yeah, I think it feels like we are a lot more in touch, but obviously for some people that feels really difficult and they can't tolerate it.
And is there anything that when you start questioning yourself on, working towards recognizing others' suffering, are there anything that we can tell ourselves, to work on those perceptions that we have, maybe?
Yeah, I guess it's important that we are caring towards ourselves. We're often caring towards others, and kind of working in the NHS, we often see people, staff, learn to be very caring towards others, but actually really struggle with being caring towards themselves or receiving care. And I think often in society, there are lots of people who really struggle with being caring towards themselves. Compassion, self-compassion isn't about avoiding, just saying, do you know what, I'm just going to go and sit in a bath and be nice and caring to myself. it's a lot more than that. It's about saying, actually, what is the most caring? So if you are having, thoughts where you're kind of really bullying yourself, for example, it's around saying, actually, how can I be more caring?
Mm-hmm.
What can I do? Yes, of course, we all struggle, but actually, how can I support myself? What wisdom is there about this situation? What have I learned throughout my life? Which means that I am a lot more critical towards myself. And actually, how can I lower that? How can I reduce the volume of that self-criticism so that actually I'm not in my threat system all the time?
Okay. And this is a very hard thing to do, to sit with yourself. And we tend to be hard on ourselves sometimes compared to others. Like we were taught to be kind, maybe like most of us were taught to be kind to others and to do good and so on. Then we tend to forget that we have to do the same thing towards ourselves.
Yeah.
And what do you think? Well, you did mention that asking ourselves the right questions is one way to go about that. Are there other strategies that can help with self-critical and negative self-talk, basically?
Mm-hmm. I guess the first thing is you need to recognize you're doing it. Often it becomes quite automatic and you don't realize you're having self-critical thoughts, or they're, like you said, negative automatic thoughts. They just come. I guess it's about recognizing, again, thinking about what we were talking about in terms of yoga, recognizing when you have those self-critical thoughts, how does it feel in the body? How does it land in the body? What starts to appear? Can you then really slow down and think, actually, is there another way? Is there another way to reframe this where I'm not attacking myself? Or recognizing, where has this come from? Can I say it's not my fault, but it's my responsibility to change this? So yeah, self-critical thoughts will appear, but I guess how can we reduce the volume of them and have an approach which, for example, so a good example might be, actually, if you had a friend in this situation, what would you say to them? You're being self-critical. Would they say the same thing? Or would you say the same thing if they were having this little conversation to themselves? What would be the most caring thing you would say to that self?
That kind of switches the way you think when you ask yourself that kind of question. Yeah. You pointed out something very interesting about maybe the suffering not being your fault directly, but it kind of becomes your responsibility at the point where you find out why it's happening, that it is happening. Kind of have that responsibility towards yourself to actually tackle it. Exactly. That was a very interesting point of view. And I think very helpful as well to initiate some change within ourselves.
Yeah.
And well, we actually came to the end. And before we go, I would ask you if you have any last piece of wisdom to share with our students when it comes to struggling with being kind to them.
I think sometimes being in education, we often don't feel good enough. We're trying to achieve and strive. I think achieving and striving is good and helpful, and but I guess it's the intention we're doing it from. I think it's important to think about how can we be caring beings, supporting others, but also in that process supporting ourselves. And I think it's important to recognize those harsh self-critical thoughts and making sure that we're doing things that make us feel connected to others in this alone.
Thank you so much, Doc.
Hey guys, The Wellbeing Service is launching a new method to help students raise awareness on well-being. You can send us your questions as well as suggestions just by clicking the link in the description box below. The link will also be available on all our social media platforms. Your questions shall be answered at the end of every podcast episode. If you find yourself unable to cope and need support, the Wellbeing Service at Middlesex, Mauritius can help you. Contact us at counselling@mdx.ac.mu for any queries. Thank you.